Did you go to school locally, or did you go to correspondence school? And I have no real sense of what rural Queensland would have been like.
Yes, well, rural Queensland had small convents. And we went to school there for a while. Then I won a scholarship to Downlands College, which was a boarding school in Toowoomba, run by a kind of scaled-down Jesuitical order called the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart, French order originally. And that's where I went when I won the scholarship, which would have been about that same time. Otherwise, I don't know what would have happened actually if I hadn't won that. Yeah.
And that took you away until the end of high school?
Almost the end of high school. You did high school in 4 years in Queensland then. The final year, I had decided to be a priest of that same order. So the final year I did in New South Wales, and I had to pack in their syllabus and all the rest of it into 1 year, because there was a school before you went into the novitiate. The reason for that, rather trite I think in retrospect, was I think that I did not, to put it mildly, have great affection for my father for various reasons, and some of the people there, two of the priests in particular, became very strong, very, very strong father figures for me. And I think I identified with that, and I wanted to be the same as them. I did have other inclinations, particularly but by the time I was ready to leave there, I had a rather wonderful girlfriend, and made this agonizing decision that nonetheless I was going into this so-called celibate world,
That was when you would have been about 16?
16, 17, yes. 16.
And so you did go off to the seminary?
I did, yeah. It didn't last too long. I went into finished the education. They went into the novitiate for about almost a year. But in the novitiate, you're supposed to sort of empty out all sort of self-regard and give yourself over to the regime and to the beliefs and so on that are involved. And I think as part of a strategy, the novice master is quite, tough and bullying. So I remember the actual incident that precipitated my leaving was every meal was silent. Well, we had long periods of silence, Every meal was silent, and so different people had to read during the meal. And I remember I was reading a biography of Conrad Adenauer, and one thing that the novice master used to do in front of the whole community, as they were monks as well as the novices, was to correct people about their pronunciations in front of everyone else, and you had to come out with a formulaic response was, thank you, Reverend Father, I humbly accept and appreciate correction, all the rest of it. So he corrected me on some pronunciation, and I said in front of the whole community, no, you're wrong. And the tinkling of cutlery stopped instantly, and there was a suspension of a long silence, and then he told me to come around and see him after that, and I thought, I'm going to get hell now. And he said, well, look, and no, I said to him, it's not working out, I'm going to leave. And he said, no, you have a very strong vocation. It's just that we have a conflict of personalities between us. You should stay. But I didn't.
And so what took you from there? What happened next? Did you then go and study law?
What happened next was I went back to Dalby, Queensland, and worked for my uncle on the road, driving a roller, which would only go in reverse gear. While they were building roads in an airport, a little airport. Did that for about a year, and then said to my dear mother that I was off, I wanted adventure, I was going to travel. And she said, very firmly that you had to get a qualification first. And there happened to be, I had not thought about doing law at all, even remotely. But there was there were three small law firms there, and the bigger one, the biggest, was looking for an article clerk. So I went to dinner at the senior partner's house and called him sir, which apparently made a big impact. And I was offered that job, and then I was paid £2.50 a week and lived with my mother for that period. Then you could do a degree by correspondence at the University of Queensland. You couldn't get grades for it. It was either pass or fail. and it normally took 7 years. I badgered them. They let me do it in 6. So that's how I did the law degree, during that time.
And do you remember?
And I was admitted as a solicitor.
Do you remember much of what you studied? Was that a formative influence on you intellectually?
Oh my God! I can't tell you how much it was, and the novice master was right, and you've got a vocation. He just had the wrong vocation. I mean, it was absolutely stunning. I think from Downlands, the I forget what they call the head, but Tim Kelly, who left the priesthood and became something of a. He taught in this university in the end. He was one of my heroes, and also somebody called Brendan Sykes, another priest. Who was totally generous. Like when I was studying, like I did French as one of my degrees, you had to do a couple of art subjects and so on. And of course, doing French at university when you don't hear anyone speaking French is a slightly disadvantageous position to be in. So I used to go up, frequently, and he'd work through plays of Racine and Molière and so on with me, and help me write out pieces on it. And so I just learned from both of them some kind of commitment to scholarship, I think. And I didn't see it like that then. But apart from, mildly wicked weekends in Brisbane, I spent every night, my dear mother was so patient and supportive, every night over a desk working on the degree.
What was the contents of jurisprudence or legal theory in those days at that place?
Well, I do remember it. It was conventional but good. But I can't remember much of it. I just remember thinking this is pretty straightforward stuff. But the chap who did it, his name I forget, did a very good job. But when I say did a good job, you just got notes. Sometimes they were 10 years out of date, But some of them, not many of them, did pay great attention to, if you turned in an essay or something, some of them felt quite provoked about it and wrote me long responses. That wasn't the norm. And he did, I remember, so there was already an inclination of the, treacherous path I was about to tread, I think, engaging with him,
So just to take you back to the earlier part, would you say there were certain intellectually formative experiences from, let's say, your training in Catholicism, which then became influential for you in your later vocation?
I think probably you get oriented towards, without undertaking it purposively, you get oriented towards a certain sustaining of thought in the novitiate, in the seminary generally, because, as I said, it was sort of a Jesuit-type order, and so we had to meditate on this 14 volumes of Ignatius Loyola, and spent a long time doing that. And of course, it's not meditation like in the sense of transcendental meditation or something like that, where I don't know what we do actually, but I think you waft away pretty successfully if it's going well. This is more rigorous in quote stuff, where you had to think through things. And you had to appreciate that there was another dimension beyond the connective intellectuality of it. But nonetheless, it was an intellectual exercise, because he was quite an intellectual as well. So I think probably like that, that probably gave me sort of a grounding and an orientation in that direction, of which I was entirely unaware as far as that functional or instrumental aspect goes,
When you were practicing and then you did your degree, and you'd come from this environment that gave you a certain orientation, which I imagine was not the habitual one shared by people who were studying with you in a certain sense. I know you were by correspondence, but so how did you then relate to practicing law in Australia and in Queensland in particular? What were you doing?
Well, I was in a practice which I think got more of the elite type work in the town and the surrounding countryside, because it's huge farms and pastoral areas around it. So the senior partners and people, I was of course at the bottom of the room at the back sort of thing. And so they did all the interesting stuff, namely lucrative stuff, and I got stuff passed down to me, which was the really interesting stuff. So it'd be minor criminal matters, and so on and so forth. And then I did stay on with them for a little while afterwards. I got, sorry, I don't know whether I should say all this, admitted in first place on the roll as a solicitor, and then stayed with them for about another year before leaving. But it was basically, estates of people who didn't have much money, divorces where the people didn't have much income to, pay for extensive and dedicated commitment and representation, and my partners, my senior, not that I wasn't a partner, but my seniors were interested in wrapping up very quickly and so on. So I got a lot of that sort of stuff, which I found absolutely fascinating.
Would there have been an expectation for a person like you, I don't really know what I mean by that, but to go to the bench eventually or something like that?
Well, coming back after, an extensive period and getting some sort of view from talking to people around here about the kind of networks of people my age, of course, there's been various dinners and that put on while I was here. I can see a trajectory that would have been similar to that, and which I would have probably thought that was a pretty high, or the highest aspiration I could have in terms of being committed to law. And I would say, yes, that's what I would have hoped, probably, yeah.
And so what did happen?
Oh, what did happen was that there's a chap called Paul Gerber who taught torts and also collected art wonderfully. And he was the only one that took a really strong interest in what I wrote. And he would want to meet and discuss it.
What do you mean what you wrote? What were you writing?
Essays. Just coursework.
At university?
Yes, at university, coursework, yeah. And so he would write very long comments and engage with them. And I'd come down, we'd get together, and he had a lovely man, a lovely family. So when I was in Brisbane, so at the end of my degree, I was immediately offered a job at the University of Queensland in law, as a tutor they called it, but that was a prelude to hopefully becoming a lecturer. And I was desperate to take it because I'd never even been inside the university, done this degree. And so, and I had this overwhelming, this might link up with Adil's question, I had this overwhelming urge to be an academic, which might have been just a matter of, deprivation of some kind. But so I was about to say yes, and then Paul Gerber got in touch and revealed that he was a headhunter for a firm called Baker & McKenzie, which is the world's biggest, or was then the world's biggest law firm. And he said, well, look, they're after somebody to be a link between Sydney and London, and you spend most of your time in London. I said, no, Paul, I'm coming to teach at the university. He said, you're mad. He said, any lawyer would give his right arm for this job. So I said to myself, still young and impressionable, or even more impressionable, that if Paul Gerber says it, it must be right. So I took the job, and that's how I ended up in London. Yeah.
And how long did you stay there?
I was at Baker McKenzie for 2 years. I enjoyed it very much, mainly because I enjoyed London very much. It led to me getting in certain entanglements that you know about.
Married.
Which have been the most significant thing that's happened to me. And although I had great affection for, it was a very different legal world then. You weren't assessed and all the rest of it, even though it was a very big firm and all the rest of it. It was very convivial, wonderfully convivial, horribly and wonderfully long lunches and so on. You just had to tolerate people talking about rugby scores all the time. But I found it boring compared to the little practice that I had indulged in Dalby, Queensland. And I didn't have any intention of leaving in the near future, but I was thinking about it, and I was contacted by William Twining, and I don't know why he had that contact. And he said, well, I'm coming to London, can we have a chat? I'd like you to teach corporate law. I said, okay, I'd be very happy to talk to you. So he took me to Twining's Tea House on the Strand. He sat down opposite me and looked around very expectantly. I, of course, crashed and didn't respond adequately, and eventually, of course, he made the connection, Twining, me, family, and all the rest of it. And he said, well, I want you to teach corporate law. I said, okay, fine. And it wasn't a heavy job because Tom Haddon was going to teach it with me.
What university was this
This
from?
Belfast.
Belfast.
Queen's Belfast. And he said, well, there's somebody else from Queen's around at present. We can interview you as an interview panel and do it properly. I said, okay, I'll be interviewed. So he interviewed me and gave it to me. And then we went to live in Belfast.
What year was that?
It was the same year as all the Troubles broke out. Lord, I know, 67. Because I accepted the job, and then all hell broke loose, large areas burnt down, bombs are going off everywhere in the conflict. And so I very hesitantly approached Shelby, my fairly brand new spouse at the time, and said, is it still all right if we go? And she said, well, why do you ask? I said, well, look what they're doing over there to each other. She said, you forget I lived in Chicago for 4 years. So on that basis we went, and it was the most amazing experience. I know that sounds slightly, irresponsible or even facetious too, because it was so horrible in other ways. But, well, for a start, I'll be quick about this. Academic generosity. I landed totally keen to teach and to get in. Of course, William Twining, he was a professor. He was only aged about 4.5, but he was, he was a professor in charge of jurisprudence. And I said to William, I want to teach this. In the jurisprudence, I want to teach that, I want to teach that, as well as the corporate law. He said, no, you're not allowed to. He said, that lovely flat you've got, there's that room up the top, if you noticed, I want you to sit there, I want you to write. First year, hardly anything to do, because he was insisting on my writing, because he said I'd been in practice for so long, one way or another. He said, you've got to catch up. So I wrote and sort of caught up. And then, but the most amazing thing was the involvement in what was going on, because we very rapidly, when I say we, law and social sciences, rapidly formed what we call social action groups, and also caught up with an outfit called Child Poverty Action Centre. And we would go into areas where fighting was taking place or had taken place, and they were all massively, terribly deprived areas, to be blunt about it. And we'd offer advice and try and put forward class actions to help with, council not adequately attending to condensation and all the rest of it. That was very difficult. You'd do that for a few weeks, and then you'd turn up and the other side was occupying it and they'd want to know who you are, sort of thing. So, but that was very involving and amazing. But the divide was so deep. It was so deep. I'll just give you one example of how deep it was. Shelby turned up, and immediately, at that stage, the Belfast Telegraph, which was the Northern Ireland paper, sort of thought, the war would be over by Christmas, really. So they had a Belfast Telegraph fund, which you could donate to help people who had just been burnt out of their homes and so on, mainly Catholics. And so they're asking for people to volunteer to go and inspect these sites for people who claimed compensation out of the Belfast Telegraph Fund, in order to make sure they were genuine, they're actually sitting on a pile of rubble. And the number of persons who Shelby volunteered, as soon as she hit the ground, she saw this and she went and did it. The number of people who volunteered was 1. And that was Shelby. So, I think the expectation would have been that all these good middle-class Protestant women would take this up, but nobody did.
How did the divide play out in the law school?
Not at all. It was a marvellous place. Yeah. It didn't figure at all.
Do you remember what the first thing was that you wrote when you were sent to your garret?
No, sorry. And I didn't even look at my CV before this, I'm sorry.
What was the involvement of the students like, and your interaction with the students?
It was very strangely, now that you ask, Adil, it was strangely insulated. It didn't relate much to the wider world at all, it was it was just, I mean, Queens is in the, not quite the middle, but it's smack bang close to the middle of Belfast, so it was not exactly geographically situated and apart. And we had students from both sides of the fence, as it were, but never had any effect whatsoever that I could observe. Yeah.
So in terms of the universities and the sort of university as a space, was the experience different from Queensland in any significant way?
I'd never had experience of the space in Queensland, though, to say, so I don't know. Yeah. It was very pleasant. It was, I was appointed on a temporary thing, and then I applied, the permanent job came up and I got that, I applied for that. And I remember being interviewed by, and I thought the interviewing panel was, how shall I say, very middle class. That might be a bit of an understatement, actually.
So quite an elite, insulated,
exactly, yes.
Stable, convivial place.
Yeah.
So what were you reading and writing then? Even if it's not the exact thing. What was the intellectual conversation like?
Well, it would have had a lot to do eventually, for the second year I was there anyway with jurisprudence, because William then did let me teach some of it. I sort of would have been involved in that, but I can't remember specifically what, and I can't remember what I wrote. I know that at some stage, I think it might have been about then, I did get more involved in anthropology.
Yeah. I was wondering about that, because the next question, which obviously springs to mind, is how did you get from Belfast to Papua New Guinea?
Yes, okay. The brief answer to that is that Mr. Justice Minogue, who was head of the Supreme Court in Papua New Guinea, got in touch with me and said he was coming over to London. Could I come over and meet him, because he'd like to talk to me about doing some work in Papua New Guinea? And I left at that, I have to say.
This was before Papua New Guinea independence, or after?
It was about 3 to 4 years before self-government, and then independence came a couple of years after self-government.
And so what was it that he wanted you to do?
Well, he, well, first of all, I was perplexed as to why he asked me, but he said Geoffrey Sawyer, who was at the Australian National University, socio-legal, or probably, no, sociologist of law, I think, wasn't he? Something like that, but I don't think I ever met him. And he said that Sawyer had recommended me to him.
How would he have known you? Were you publishing, or?
I don't know.
Or is this through the kind of Australian networks of a certain kind?
I have the foggiest idea, sorry. But I was just, intrigued, and that was his answer. What he'd done, he was marvellous, really, and what he'd done was, he was Australian, and what he'd done was get money from the Commonwealth Foundation, completely his idea, and the idea was that I would study village-level economic organisation, and with a view to forming corporate groups which were not corporate in the sense that people would have to have expertise and access to specialist services and expensive modalities of accounting and complying with legal requirements of the registrar of companies and so on. So the idea would be to study their own ways of doing things and to incorporate those in some kind of a constitution, which would then get registered over the registrar of companies' dead body, as it turned out. No, he wasn't a dead body, but the Prime Minister. Yeah. The Prime Minister had to sit on him pretty heavily, and so that's how it started. And then I started doing that, flying around the place, talking to people, and trying to get some kind of a grip on it, and loving it. And Shelby just loved it immensely. She set up a Montessori school and so on. It was a fantastic experience. Anyway, so our neighbour worked in the Prime Minister's office, and he kept nagging me, saying, come and join us, and I said no.
Which Prime Minister was this?
Samari. He was called Chief Minister. it was out of the question before that because it was still Australian rule, pure and simple. The elections came up, and everyone expected the Conservatives, mainly folks in the Highlands, to win. But the more progressive, I suppose might be one way to put it, parties formed a coalition, and Samari was the first chief minister appointed. So at that stage, possibilities opened up, and then our neighbour was putting pressure on me to come and join the Prime Minister. And I was, at that stage, was an absolutely intolerant, radical in quotes, who didn't want to join any sort of colonial or post-colonial government. So anyway, he kept going and made good arguments about it. So one day we were talking about it, and I said, well, look, you're very dedicated to this. You've committed your life to it. Tell me, what chance do you think there is of your making any kind of a significant, or me making, for that matter, any kind of a significant contribution? He said, well, I think about 10%. And so I said, 10% is good enough for me. And I joined the Prime Minister's office. So I was doing all sorts of other things, but I still did some of the other work, not so much as research, but by way of actually doing it. So much so that by the time I left, 6 years later, weeping because I didn't want to go, but I thought the time of the white advisor was over, I thought, well, I've sort of blown that. I don't know what to write. And then we came back by way of Shelby's place in Mississippi, and I was just sitting on the veranda of the cottage, and that book that Adil showed me earlier on came to me. I didn't expect to write it or know that I would write Lord State in Papua New Guinea.
So when you left New Guinea, were you thinking you would go back to the university?
What happened, again, sorry, this is complicated, but briefly. What happened was we planned to come back to Australia.
Yeah.
Well, I planned to come back to Australia, and Shelby agreed. And I applied for a job at the ANU, and I think it was in one of those research schools. I don't think it was specific studies, I can't remember. But I was told informally by a friend there who's actually involved in the process that I had it. And then there was the coup in November 75, when Whitlam was kicked out and so on. My job mysteriously disappeared. I don't know why. I was never told. Nobody ever contacted me to say anything about it. It just wasn't there. I know I wasn't very popular with Australian colonial officials, so I don't know whether there's some seepage. It's total mystery. And so I had to find a job very quickly. I had, two little things about that high and about that high, and a beautiful, somewhat higher thing to support, and that's how we ended up in England. Because I'd known Claire Pally, who was the first woman law professor in the UK, whom I knew her in Belfast, and she somehow got in touch with me and said, would I be interested in coming to Kent, and then went to Kent.
And so you went to Kent with the law and the state in Papua New Guinea in your head?
Just in the head, yes, yeah. I must have rattled it off pretty quickly because it was published soon after that, yeah.
So were you reading when you were in PNG? Were you reading a lot, and a lot of anthropology, for example?
Oh, yeah. And I had the most wonderful people to talk to. Prime among those was Marilyn Strathern. I mean, she was always in the bush somewhere in the Highlands, but whenever we got together, it was terrific. So, as an environment for doing that, it was absolutely perfect. But it was also perfect in the sense that you would come to a place, and sometimes the rest of the family would come along, and immediately, even though you didn't really know too much about the people you were going to, we all felt totally at one with it because of their people's response, and would, for instance, you'd be in a hut with long steps going down. After 2 minutes, this collection of girls, around about 11 to 14, would turn up. They'd take out kids, put them on their skinny hips, run off. You'd never see them again, and they had a ball, So it was just wonderful. There are other conflictual elements involved, which were very relevant to some of the stuff I did. But by and large, one learned a lot.
In terms of your encounter with the anthropologists at the time, and also the topic of what you're writing about in the book, were there many legal scholars at the time really working on these questions?
In terms of what these questions were, there were legal anthropologists, anthropologists who are interested in law rather than lawyers who are interested in anthropology, really. And there were quite a few of them. It wasn't a huge field, but it had been around a while. I mean, you could date it back to Malinowski, really, because, he's Trebrian stuff is wonderful on law. And comes out, with very sensitive and attuned accounts of the law, as opposed to Hart citing him in the concept of law as authority for Malinowski, saying that Trebrian didn't have any law. Malinowski says the opposite and does it very well. And so that did sort of start a tradition of it. But I don't think, I could be quite wrong about this, but because I haven't even thought about the question, Adil, but I don't think anyone had written about it like I was doing it, which was, trying to situate that concern within decolonization and the reconfiguring of people, of their own relationships within the incipiently post-colonial scene.
Was this a moment when people were writing about development in places like PNG? So were there people who were writing in ways that you were precisely not writing?
Yeah. Not so much development in PNG. I don't think there's much written on that, but the overall generic cast would have been about development as a good thing, and looking at law and so on in that perspective. I think that was very much predominant.
Well, this must have been about the same time as the birth of the law and development movement.
Exactly. Yeah.
Would you recollect this also being as a particular moment where development, especially as modernization, had run into a bit of a crisis? So in the book you mentioned the fact that new ways of thinking about development were emerging at that time.
Right.
Was there something particular about that moment that you recall?
I can't recall, no.
Were you unusual as a white man to be writing in that kind of vein? Or thinking in the vein that ultimately ended up being that book?
The book really wasn't a result of my engaging with the disciplines and the tendencies that were there. What happened was that I did the research for a while in a preliminary way. Then I got involved in what was seemingly other stuff. And so I wasn't just working on that. I was working on investment, helping draft a bit of the constitutional work. It was quite miscellaneous. And then acting as a kind of companion to some ministers when they were engaging in various trips and projects and so on, mainly in agriculture. So I wasn't sort of immersed in an academic world that was connecting to that. I mean, I did a bit of teaching at the university, but nonetheless, I didn't sort of think of myself as connecting to that in a way. But I suppose, given what Adil was saying about the book, I must have touched on that. But I think it was ex post justification for what I was doing. I was trying to find an academic label or academic concerns to put it in. I don't think it was motivated or impelled by those concerns. It was motivated or impelled by the fact that I was doing this work. And I thought, oh my God, I've blown that. Mr. Justice Monet was quite happy, actually, for me to work with the government and not pursue the research so avidly. I don't know how he squared off the Commonwealth Foundation, which, again, was very kind and generous of him. But I just, as I say, it just sort of came together in terms of what I'd actually been doing, but without any disciplinary or generic academic generic connections whatsoever, except I think as by way of ex post justification.
That's really fascinating. I'm also thinking about the book you brought back with you, how it sort of might have been a bit like, I'm thinking with anthropologists, like a bit of field work, and you come back and it makes strange what you might have taken as normal vis-a-vis, let's say, the law you were teaching in Australia or in the UK. That you feel that was the case?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to read an anthropological account and say, well, that's different and interesting and all the rest of it, but to be immersed in it, and to, what was particularly telling is that some of the work I did was in fairly large scale type of situations where you'd have the Papua New Guineans who were in sort of form of local government of the colonial empathetic kind, and then there were radical youth, and mainly radical youth and very heterodox religious movements which would oppose that. And so part of what I was supposed to be doing, and what the Prime Minister wanted me to do, was to go to these areas and try and bring them together by way of these, we call them, I'm sorry about the term, development corporations, but they were meant to combine the economic and the political, not to be confined to the economic, by way of bringing the two sides together. And then, we'd have a feast. That I didn't do that bit, or have anything to do with it, but people automatically said, oh, we're coming here, we must have a feast. Prime Minister would fly in sometimes, and that would be it. But what I was doing is I was drawing up the constitution of those places. Now, often it was the case, I'd talk to people a lot to try and get a gist on it. I'd look at any anthropological literature relevant to such people, not that it was always there, in order to draw up what were inform the articles of association of a company, but which were a very unusual sort of constitution for a company to have, because it was meant to reflect, etc., but also not as it was in terms of some frozen, historical sense, or trying to get what it was like purely in anthropological terms before the adulteration of colonialism or development or whatever it might be, but also to incorporate within the constitution and the way things were going to be run, hopefully, what was actually happening, by way of opposition and compromises between that and so on. Now, I'm not saying I played a grand, majestic role and brought it all together. Sometimes I was just left sitting there for days looking at the pigs, wandering around, waiting for something to happen, because they had these. It triggered off connections, and so they had these meetings and often reached agreements, and I just sort of walked in the end and wrote down what they told me, sometimes practically. So it was very, it's a horrible word, but immersive, apart from occasionally talking to Marilyn Strathern or something like that, I didn't have academic connections which were relevant to what was actually going on.
So if the impetus wasn't an intellectual one, in the sense that it wasn't an experience that came from an intellectualized account and then went to the field, how would you explain, or how do you think about your sensibility? I suppose this is a bit like the question I asked you earlier about Indigenous people and white Australia. Because one of the things that's striking about the book is the figuration of people from PNG who figure very differently in that book than they do in other texts of the time that are written in a sort of law and development vein, or even in a law and anthropology vein. Although that's probably an anachronistic way to put that last thing. So do you have a sense of what it was politically or ethically, or in your, it may be a personality thing, that allowed you to think differently than most of Australia must have been thinking about PNG?
Quite a question. Again, I fall back on that horrible word immersive. I think I just had a tendency to throw myself into these things, and I think that sort of took over. I do think that, obviously I can't be sure of this sort of thing, but I do think that my upbringing, I have a perverse debt to my father, who was not, to put it mildly, a very kind man. And it was a quite traumatic childhood for all of us in many ways. Me less than my siblings. I was the eldest. And it was easier on me because I was the eldest and going to fulfill the place on the farm and all that sort of thing. But I think from that I got, in terms of supporting my mother invariably for some reason, some kind of a thing about injustice. And how that should be rectified, So I think that was some kind of an impulse, which might have explained the feeling that I illustrated by way of the conversation with the indigenous gentleman on the stairs. I think it's rooted back there somewhere. So I'm sort of grateful in retrospect to my father for inculcating that verse.
That's quite telling in one sense. But it could have gone both ways, in the sense that you could have arrived in PNG with a strong sense of needing to right injustice and right wrongs, and done what so many others did, which was to save the natives.
Right.
And that's not what you wrote, it's not what you did. So I'm wondering how you experienced Australia's relationship to PNG, or what was happening in PNG, such that you essentially, I suppose I'm saying, how did you become so critical?
Okay.
So what's the relationship between the sense of injustice and the way that you went about thinking about the relation between people?
I think, again, this is just a somewhat peculiar take on it, but the association between injustice and constraint. And I saw constraint. This is purely retrospection. I'm not saying I saw it then, but just thinking about it now. I saw constraint in the academy, in the way these things were formulated, and I was particularly. I used to write against legal anthropology in a rather intemperate way. I remember. As a form of constraint, as the conceptual filters and destinations that these ideas had to fit into and conform to and be interpreted in terms of. I saw all of that as being something that you can't really absorb and reduce in those terms without at least heavily qualifying it and putting it radically differently to the way self-confident way in which it was being expressed and rendered. And I think the fact that I don't draw very much on legal anthropology or so on in that book might reflect the aftermath of that preliminary engagement with it. Yeah.
I had another question which might be another way of getting at this sort of issue we've been discussing with your interest in art, literature, and poetry. Where does that come from? When did you start reading things outside? And what were you reading initially? What were your interests?
I think in terms of my writing about literature and law, that's pretty recent. But I've always, as far as I can remember, read poetry and novels. I don't think I've ever read a biography or anything like that, except I'm currently, I was going to say immersed, but that's overstating it, read a kind of biographical thing with East West Street at Philippe Sands, which I'm about to give up on. But I think probably a lot of that, because I remember our house didn't have any books. It had Mears Children's Encyclopedia, I think, was about the sole repository of literature for children and so on the shelves. I think it came going back to downloads, Tim Kelly. who was passionate and a wonderful teacher of English. And I would pretty confidently put it down to him. But ever since then, I've just been absolutely... I mean, I don't do it so much now, but I used to write a lot of poetry. I still do occasionally, but not very much. And so it's always been there as far as I can remember. But as far as I can remember is I think, back to Tim Kelly, really. Yeah. I'd say pretty well 100% to him, yeah.
So let me take you back to another influence. Not a poet, perhaps, but Marx.
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah.
Can you say something about how Marx figures in Law and the State in Papua New Guinea, and how you came to think about your experience in PNG through the lens of a certain, I don't want to say Marxism, but thinking with Marxist thought?
That's a very lovely way to put it, actually, which sort of gets me out of bed. It was thought, the reception of the book in Papua New Guinea was amazing. It got a lot of attention, and I found out.
What year did it come out? 1980, I think. I think it is 1980.
79.
So 5 years after independence, proper independence.
Yeah. And then on the 10th anniversary of independence, that's what I was asked to come and give this keynote for this Waigani seminar. I've encountered in some of the seminars that I was asked to do around it a hostility because of the Marxism in it. And I'd never thought of it as Marxist, pure and simple. I thought of it as drawing on Marx and probably Pachacanis and so on, as a way of getting to grips with those things. But in retrospect, I think it was probably more Marxist than I'd actually intended it, in a sense, to be, in the way it came across. And of course, it's a very difficult thing to have some kind of a qualified relationship to Marxism. It's you either buy it or you don't. Neo-Marxism and all the rest of it, and all those attenuations, could be very, very good ways to develop things. But I think Marxism, as such, it's not. It's difficult to mess around with. I don't know. I think, again, it was probably the injustice bit.
Was Marx a sort of typical reading for a person in your intellectual milieu at the time?
Not at all. For some, I don't know, not at all. I remember I was very young, say, in Australia, and I was, just by way of that orientation, was immersed in Labour Party politics and conferences, stood for elected office, and so on. So I think there was that orientation there anyway. And I think that carried over into the academic side. I think in retrospect, it does look to be rather constricting, I suspect, but from what Adil has told me elsewhere about the book, I don't know very much about it anymore. I'm fascinated to go and read a bit of it. But I do think it's probably, I think it had something to do with, the problem we always have with how in the hell are we going to do this? We want to engage in these kind of scales and dimensions which are very difficult to get some kind of conceptual or much less descriptive grip on. So we're trying to find frames, through which we can do it, yet still not distort them, to present them in a way. And I think Marxism provided that. If I look at my bookshelves now from then, there's quite a bit of Marxism, but not a great deal. So I don't think it was an overwhelming influence.
I think it was one of the things that's interesting about Law and the State in Papua New Guinea is the unusual sense of the Eurocentrism of the Marxist critique. So one of the things that means that I still would refer students to it is that you push back against the developmentalism that most Marxists of the period would have taken up in relation to the South, let's call it, or the Third World.
Right.
And so I found the book on the chapter on the bourgeois state and your account of both the movement of global capital and a certain resistance to it
Right.
as actually not orthodox Marxism at all,
No.
in the way that an orthodox Marxism would end up being a progressive developmentalist story.
Right.
So, I mean, that's interesting, because even your heterodoxy was heterodox.
Yes. I mean, it probably caused some confusion, because I mean, one of the responses I remember when I went back on that adventure that I talked about, the Waigani seminar and so on, one of the responses that people did make explicit in discussions and so on was that I was trying to be a Marxist, but it wasn't really a Marxist book. So I think they got it right in a kind of oblique sense. Yeah.
Did you have any intellectual companions at that point? Were there people with whom you talked about ideas, or people who influenced you? Because you would have still been a really young scholar at that point, because that, in a way, that was a sort of PhD work.
Yeah, I guess
if
so.
you wanted to think about it like that.
Yeah.
So who were your intellectual influences in a personal sense, not just reading?
Well, I mean, in terms of companionship and support, in terms also of broad consensus, without being very specific about the intellectual content of what it might be, Abdul Palawala he and I were very close, and he's at Warwick now, or just emeritus recently, and remained very close. Apart from that, although the law faculty at University of Papua New Guinea then was interesting and had interesting people in it, and I enjoyed meeting up with them, I can't think of any companionship. No, I mean, I think somebody like Marilyn Strathern would have been a more constant companion, except that she inconsiderately was often away doing field work and so on.
And what about when you got back to England?
I've always, sorry, this sounds rather pathetic. I think I've been a bit of a loner in these ways, until I accumulated these things called PhD students. And I was discussing with Shelby earlier on. She said she thought that was a definitive stage of my engagement with people and with thought beyond just sitting at that desk and being, grumpily absorbing stuff. She thought once I started accumulating PhD students at Kent, and then that carried on fairly expansively thereafter into London. Of course, London's a much greater way of deceiving people to come and spend time with you doing a PhD because of the joys of London. She thought that was a definitive stage in the way I operated.
And when was this?
Well, Kent would have been at the end of Papua New Guinea period. That would have been 75 or 76 actually, 76. And of course, I didn't accumulate PhD students immediately. I was there 20 years, about halfway through, I'd say.
So, do you remember who your first PhD student was?
First PhD student in law. When I was at Kent, I was in two different departments, interdisciplinary studies and law, but eventually the university espoused interdisciplinary studies conspicuously and abolished interdisciplinary studies, of course. Beginning marketisation and so on. First one in law was, and this is incipiently corrupt relationship, was Colin Perrin, who is now a commissioning editor for Routledge, and publishes any PhD book of the thesis that I think he should publish. So that's slightly exaggerated.
What was he working on, do you remember?
Well, Colin was, going back to the term heterodox, he was working on human rights, but he had some interest in the colonial and post-colonial dimensions on it as well. I mean, he did that wonderful opening chapter to a book that Eve Jane Smith and I edited called Post-Colonial Law or something like that.
Laws of the Post-Colonial.
Thank you very much. Laws of the Post-Colonial. So it was human rights in that but it wasn't a thesis in a way, because Colin, I was going to say stubbornly, but he was such a gentle man, he wouldn't be stubborn, but somehow very successfully wrote it as 8 distinct chapters. And I did try to convince him that it would be good to have connections of an explicit kind between them. But no, he wanted to submit it like that. And I said, well, I think you're going to get through, you're going to have a hell of an examination. He's examined for 3 to 4 hours, I can't remember. So
this makes quite a bit of sense, in the sense that the PhD student turns out to maybe have been as important to you as you are to them eventually. And I'm interested in that certain sense of loneliness, if I can call it that,
yeah,
which is sort of about your formation now. It's starting to make sense, and the intellectual companionship that came from having PhD students. Do you think that shapes your conduct in relation to your PhD students? Because you are extremely well known for being an outstanding supervisor. But it sounds like you didn't have a supervisor or mentor on whom you modelled that conduct. So I'm just wondering how you worked out how to conduct yourself.
Ah, interesting. I mean, it's probably a combination of, I had no model whatsoever. And of course, I never did a PhD anyway. So. I think, if we take the trajectory forward to combine a couple of things, I think the solitary bit, linking up with the possibility of being otherwise to that, was a pretty potent combination. And without being negative at all about some of my colleagues, with whom, by and large, I've had enjoyable and good relations with them, and learnt a lot in various different ways, but more or less ad hoc, common room conversations and so on. I have to say, that's very English, I have to say, that my PhDs have been my intellectual community.
So when did I was going to say notorious, when did the famous institution of the Fitzpatrick Reading Group begin? Was that a conscious decision?
It began about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
At Kent. And it's continued pretty well ever since, yeah.
Why did you start it?
I don't know.
Was it a thing people did, or a thing that people precisely didn't do?
I don't think it was done at all. No, I'm sure it wasn't actually, yeah. At least in law, I don't know what it might have been happening in other departments. I don't think it was the thing to do. Well, one part of it, of course, one doesn't know the totality of these things, and it's impossible to know them, but I think it partly was the loner side, combined with the, excitement of working with people in that closeness and developing ideas and discussion as a result, that I probably tweeted and said, well, how are we going to do this in a way that will bring us more together, or something like that, not just as for some fluffy notions of community or anything like that, but just simply because of being able to do it better. The thesis, and me being able to steal things more effectively, So I think it probably was that, really, rather than any great inspiration. I think it was pretty functional.
So after having written Law in the State in Papua New Guinea, there seems to have been it seems to have been a moment in terms of the publication of books in general around that time that must have been exciting. So I'm thinking of Said's work, because that Orientalism was 1977, wasn't it? And there would have been It must have been quite an exciting time to be thinking with ideas like that. Do you have a memory of a certain intellectual energy at that time around decolonisation or?
Absolutely, yeah. It was, this might be a matter of my limited perception, but it was, it was like an eruption in a sense. It happened, I think, quite quickly and in lots of wonderful and diverse ways, you know. I think that's right. And I loved it, yeah.
So Peter, we were just talking about the tremendous explosion in literature and critical literature at the time, at that moment.
Yeah.
Could you reflect a bit upon the changes that were taking place in legal scholarship in particular? Was this a particular moment of sort of constraints coming off, a rich moment in legal scholarship, or did that come later in your view?
No. Not necessarily in that area, but the critical legal stuff, you know, was slightly before, but pretty well, you know, within the same general ethos, I think, was taking off incredibly rapidly. The US manifestation, of course, was the first one. Didn't endure terribly long under that name. Except the critical race group lasted considerably longer. But the experience in the UK was rather different. Do you want me to say something about that?
Yeah, weren't you one of the weren't you the first convener of the Critical Legal Conference or a Critical Legal Conference?
I could get away with agreeing with that, but I'd have to be a bit more honest, I think. What happened was, the brief version of the story is that Maureen Kane, a wonderful sociologist with a touch of criminology as well, she had this idea of setting up, very soon after the US thing took off, the European Conference on Critical Legal Theory, and she asked me to give her a hand, so I wasn't my idea.
Roughly when was this?
A little bit early 80s, I think, late 70s, early 80s, something like that. It was fairly soon after I came, actually, over to England. So it'd be about 5 years after that. So that would be about 1980, around there. And so we'd, get in touch with sympathetic institutions in various countries and arrange for a conference each year. We found sympathetic institutions in lots of places, none in France, and held these. And then one sympathetic institution we found was the University of Kent, and I organised the first, the European Conference of Critical Legal Studies meeting there. Then still relegating my own role, painfully, Alan Hunt said to me, well, why don't we have a special meeting during the conference of people from the UK, see if they want to set up a UK version. So I thought it was a great idea. We formed the UK version, and then the year after that, which would be 31 years ago this year, the Conference of Critical Legal Studies, Critical Legal Conference was formed, and the first one was held at Kent, and I organised that. But again, it was all Alan's idea initially. What happened was that the CLC one gradually, not too gradually, actually took over the whole thing. And although it was UK based, it has met in a lot of different countries. South Africa, for example, Ireland, Finland, etc. Poland recently. So that whole movement in that first half of the 80s and going on from there, I think did sort of coincide with, there must have been some kind of a general unsettlement, at least, which was motivating these things, even though they're in different areas, one feels. Interesting thought, isn't it, to think what that might have been in retrospect. Yeah.
What was the experience like as a solitary scholar of these sort of collective events? Do you have any recollections of what the conference experience was like?
Oh, I loved them. I suppose that connects with being solitary, but still reasonably sociable, you know. Absolutely loved them. And I loved organising. Organised lots of those, including with Maureen all the European stuff, you know. That was great. Yeah.
And this was at a time in Britain when things were veering to the right.
Yeah.
So did that give the movement added fillip, do you think?
Yeah, it doubtless did, because that perception and its immediate impact on the academy, in law at least, say at Kent at the time, was very much felt. I mean, Kent divided quite dramatically into two halves, into a critical half and a traditional half, for want of a better adjective. And it was very strongly, there was a very strong division, not very pleasant. I found it very uneasy because I was critical, but I was also friendly with various people in the opposing camp, and had to. And the critical people didn't like me. It was very sharp when you think about it, because the critical people certainly didn't like me doing that. So I still continued to be something of a loner, even while all this other remarkable stuff was going on. No, there was something of an onslaught on universities too. I mean, Thatcher brought in a law which took away tenure, in the sense that universities could justify sacking people on economic grounds. Academic tenure, you know, would not be a bar to that, either conventionally or legally, if it ever existed legally. As the way the world's gone since, any university practically, except say about 3 or 4 in the UK, could justify sacking people on economic grounds.
And so how did those particular currents, intellectual and political, influence the work that you did after that? So we've spent quite a lot of time talking about law in the State Republic of Guinea, but this would have been the period in which you had not yet written Mythology of Modern Law.
Right, yeah.
Which would have come out in 87. 92, sorry, not 30 years, 25 years. So 92, so this is in the 80s. So how was your thinking being shaped at this moment? That's quite an unfair question, isn't it?
No. I think the whole critical thing and the relation to people had a big influence. There were certain shortfalls, is that the word? Shortcomings of the whole thing, in that women justly complained about inadequate balance, shall we say, in terms of attendance and concerns. That was a very persistent and insistent one, but you know, it got better. Took too long. In contrast, say, to the next one at Warwick, practically everyone, if not everyone, for the last 30 years, has not accommodated, our concerns at all, really, in any significant way. So it might have been, you know, that my perverse insistence on, say, the normality of the imperial and so on, and how that's inseparable from the concerns that my colleagues, critical colleagues, had, and how the two should be seen as integral, might have sort of been inflamed as a result of that kind of experience, because it never was at all conspicuous until Warwick's going to be quite a spectacular contrast.
So even in terms of the other critical thinkers around at the time, your insistence on imperium, or the continued relevance of empire to thinking about modern law.
Yeah.
Did you experience that as unusual?
Oh, absolutely. But it's sort of relevance is one way of putting it. But Well, what I would want to argue, and did try to argue, I guess, as your wonderfully involving me in this whole exercise revealed, was that it was inseparable from the whole formation of the Occidental modern, and not in a way that was evanescent, in a way that was constantly there and remains there. It might take various different guises, but the, shall we say, ontological stance that's involved, if we can sort of generalize that in terms of a group ontology, if that's permissible, was infused with that and remained infused with that in ways that were inseparable from other aspects of it, which were seen as quite distinct and even progressively beyond what was once an unfortunate aberration of colonialism and so on. Even the critical progressors, I'd say, often become, God, this is a bit nasty, isn't it? But anyway, often become immersed in and not sufficiently attentive to the limits of their own critical traditions and where they come from in terms of modern thought and so on.
Do you think part of your attentiveness to that was about being Australian? Because it always strikes me as very important or very noticeable how Australian scholars understand the ongoing nature of colonisation because of the presence of the colonial state in Australia still in a big way, or the ongoing colonial violence. And I'm just wondering whether the Dolby boy, you can take the boy out of Dolby, but you can't take Dolby out of the boy when you're in the critical legal milieu in England. And you're still, in some senses, sitting on the step with the Aboriginal guy.
I think it's also the case that not just in Papua New Guinea, but in other Pacific islands as well, and Australia's record there in the early 20th century was quite abysmal, and a continuation of the colonial mentality, and it was very strong, terribly strong, as opposed to what in the hell it should be, given what this country had come from itself, and I think that was probably ramped up by something that might seem to be quite unconnected, but that would be Catholicism and Irish descent, which, given the numbers, had to have some significance, but nonetheless was something that was quite markedly post-colonial in the sense that you were set apart from, banking, or the list would be rather long, but about sort of automatic connectivities, and I think. This is a preposterous thing to say, but it's just a feeling I have. I think that's still there to an extent, that the networks which go to make up, say in the legal world, who prefers who to whom, or vice versa, the judiciary appointments and so on. I just get the feeling that it's still a very constricted, no, not very perhaps, but a constricted milieu in which that happens. And even though other elements, like the Catholic and so on, figures much more conspicuously and confidently, I still feel there's these differences, which I think are quite indistinguishable given the development, in quotes, of Australia from colonial orientations.
In terms of the curious about the response that your post-colonially inflected reflections had in the British CLS milieu, and I'm sort of thinking in contrast with perhaps what happened in American CLS, where there's a split exactly on the question of race in the early 90s. How do you recollect what it was like in that? Who were your interlocutors? What were they saying? Was it ignored?
I think just wasn't on the agenda. I mean, the split in a perverse way was a tribute to the US situation. It was sufficiently conspicuous and assertive on the critical race studies to be. It'd be interesting to know, if you had a situation with the diversity that is now Australia and you were starting up in that kind of scene, I should imagine, unless you had an incredibly widespread boycott across different groups, that confronting that would be pretty well unavoidable, given the different stages at which people come, the different statuses they're occupying and so on. So as a question of continuing coloniality or disproportionate possibilities for, getting on and connecting and so on in the relational elements of, say, government, business and all the rest of it. I think these would be questioned, but they just didn't figure in the CLC really. I think. Oh, this is terrible. We're going to have to say it. I think there was a kind of an enclosedness to it, and I'm including myself, that one felt that we were resisting this other stuff, and it wasn't like it is today. You have little pockets of critical stuff happening here and there, so there's mutual support. Get swamped these days when you hold a critical legal conference. So it's a much more supportive presence. But I think it's a kind of sense of siege, before that. So one sort of got cooped up and perhaps a bit too narrow in terms of the focal orientation that was being brought to bear. Allied, I think, to a certain sense of self-justification, self-satisfaction, that one was doing that. I think we conceived ourselves in rather heroic terms, I think. Males, again, that hasn't persisted, but I think for the early history that was quite characteristic.
The other difference with the American CLC, well, not difference, the other feature of the American CLS would have been black people and the connectedness between CLS and civil rights, for example, in a political sense. So I'm wondering what the situation was like in Britain in that respect, and whether there were, who were the CLC people and what did they look like? Were they all white men?
I don't think, basically I think. I don't think, well, I think nobody wrote on race except me at that time. People now write, like, Brenner's writing on law and race and all the rest of it. It's a group of young women at Birkbeck in law have started up a critical race grouping of, or centre or something. I think it's actually a centre of some kind. So it's figuring massively belatedly in law, I think. And I'm not claiming any uniqueness in this because other people elsewhere were writing about these kind of connections. But I don't think it figured at all, sadly. Yeah.